Radio Ecoshock.
This is Alex Smith. Welcome back to the second in my series, Storm Shock, How Climate Change is Bringing More Extreme Hurricanes and Typhoons. In the first part of this series, I talked about the hurricane season of 2020 and how violent it was. We had 30 named storms in the North Atlantic, an absolute record. We had Hurricane Eta and then Iota striking Nicaragua, 4 hurricanes smashing into different places. We had 3 Philippines hit the Philippines and a couple roll right through the same place in St. Charles, Louisiana. So I talked about all that in part 1. But if you missed that, you can still learn a lot about storms in this second part, because in the first part we ended after discussing 3 essential questions. We just picked up on the first one: are hurricanes or typhoons actually stronger due to climate change, and are there more of them these days? And we went through some science and concluded that there aren't really that many more hurricanes, but the ones that do come have a tendency to be either very weak or very strong. So we're getting way more Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes, and they're boiling up faster than ever before, and that's another real danger. A tropical storm can become a major Cat 4 hurricane in just a few hours, and that makes it difficult for people to predict what their responses should be. So in this section we're going to move on to 2 other questions. The first is the phenomenon of back-to-back hurricanes new or increasing? And then finally, we're going to look at something that's a little deeper. It's how do these 2020 power storms relate to the big paper by James Hansen and about 30 other authors predicting ultra super hurricanes in the future. Is it time for those? Are we seeing the first of them? Or is it going to be a little while before those storms boil up out of the future?
You're listening to Ecoshock Radio for the world.
So here we go with back-to-back hurricanes. Remember, up until 2020, there have not been significantly more hurricanes or typhoons compared to previous decades. So why did 2020 produce one after another categorized storms striking very close to one another in both time and space? We already mentioned the case of Louisiana and the double storms that slammed Nicaragua and Central America generally. With our guest, Pinaki Chakraborty, we talked about 2 hurricanes about a week apart hitting Japan this year in 2020. But the worst case this year has hardly been reported in the West, and this isn't something from the past. On November 18th, the Sydney Morning Herald reported, quote, 3 strong typhoons over the past 3 weeks have killed more than 100 people in the Philippines and damaged farms and infrastructure. So that just happened pretty recently. The 3 typhoons were Molav, Goni, and Vamco. The first, Molav, became a typhoon on October 25th. It then bounced in the Philippines in 5 different places before striking Vietnam as the strongest storm there in years. It killed at least 100 people and did hundreds of millions of dollars in damage, mostly to some of the poorest people in the world. Information about the aftermath there is pretty sparse. The next, Typhoon Goni, was a monster storm rated at Cat 5, the highest rating. It was known in the Philippines as Super Typhoon Rolly. This was the strongest storm in the world in 2020, a year of many large hurricanes and typhoons. Scientists are now trying to rank Goni among the most intense tropical cyclones ever recorded. 1 million people were evacuated and almost 400,000 of them are still displaced, with no homes or farms to go back to. The evacuation centers are more dangerous, of course, in these storms because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's in the Philippines as well. On November 14th, Cat 4 Typhoon Vamco slammed into the Philippines. That country has its own storm naming system. So in the Philippines, Vamco is known as Typhoon Ulysses. Like Goni before it, Vamco hit several major islands of the Philippines. The capital, Manila, was badly flooded. A lot of infrastructure was damaged, which will take a very long time to replace. A state emergency was declared for all of the big island of Luzon. Cleanup operations are still going on. Past the Philippines, Vamco looked more or less spent as a tropical depression over the South China Sea. But again, the ocean surface is hotter than in past decades. The storm picked up new power, spinning up again to a Cat 4 status. It weakened slightly to Cat 2 before washing over Vietnam. And there again, the sheer amount of flooding was unexpected. And parallel to the science we discussed with Dr. Chakraborty, Typhoon Vamco went further inland, dropping extreme rainfall. Central Vietnam all the way to the Laotian border was flooded again. So what have we learned here? A fairly large group of scientists predict we will have more and more violent storms as the world heats up. If that is true, it makes sense that hurricanes or typhoons will tend to bunch up within the season that provides for their growth. This may be why we have repeat performances of these frightening storms. But we also see with such hot seas, storms don't end as we might think. Instead of dissipating after crossing land, they can get recharged over the next ocean basin and show up again as Cat 4 or 5 threats. The late season storms, both Eta and Vamco, seem particularly charged by ocean temperatures, but that may be a one-year observation. As these hurricane seasons extend, it may take a few years to gather meaningful records for the behavior of late season storms versus earlier ones. This is all so new. Well, let's get down to the deep science of the Hansen superstorms. What if all the destructive giants we've seen in 2020 are small compared to what may be coming with climate change? One of the masters of climate science, Dr. James Hansen, worries often about superstorms coming. Back in 1988, Hansen was the first to warn Congress about the threat of global warming. He was the longtime director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. In March 2016, James Hansen led 18 other accomplished scientists to publish a very large scientific paper, which was almost a compendium of Hansen's greatest worries for the future and challenges for climate science. The title is Ice Melt, Sea Level Rise, and Superstorms, Evidence from Paleoclimate Data, Climate Modeling, and Modern Observations that 2 degrees C global warming could be dangerous. I've interviewed a couple of his co-authors, including Isabella Valiconia, in a 2016 show called Dark Climate, Now and Coming. You can listen to that for free at my site ecoshock.org. Just Google it. In this program, we want to focus on what I will call Hansen's superstorms. Keep in mind, Jim Hansen's main book for the public, released in 2010, is titled Storms of My Grandchildren, The Truth About the Coming Climate Catastrophe and Our Last Chance to Save Humanity. Even so, despite his preoccupation with storms, Hansen said in a video that rising seas were an even bigger threat to civilization.
Check out the Radio Ecoshock website. We're at ecoshock.org.
Reading the 2016 paper, we find the scientists are not necessarily talking about hurricanes as such. They say, quote, many of the most significant and damaging storms in eastern North America and western Europe, particularly known as superstorms, have been winter cyclonic storms, though sometimes occurring in late fall or early spring, that generate near hurricane force winds and often large amounts of snowfall. And that's from Chapter 11. I like the way this was described by blogger and professional threat analyst Robert Marston Fanny, also known as Robert Scribbler. This is from his April 2016 blog, quote from Robert. But for more than 20 years, Dr. James Hansen has been warning that the outflush of cold water from glaciers in Greenland and Canada into the North Atlantic could set up a storm-producing weather pattern the likes of which human civilization has never seen. An atmospheric wrecking ball, the form of an intense, cold-hot dipole that, once firmly established over the Atlantic Ocean waters between North America and Europe, would carry on in brutally destructive fashion for decades and decades. In other words, as Dr. Hansen says in a video, all hell would break loose. Jim Hansen's explainer video was published on YouTube on March 21st, 2016. In the 2016 paper, Hansen and team traveled back in time to explore boulders bigger than gravel trucks, and they were tossed far inland in the Caribbean islands. They wonder if storms beyond our experience put them there. But are we already arriving at the conditions these scientists suggest will create ultra superstorms? The main requirements are two: higher sea levels and so much meltwater pouring off Greenland that it turns the mighty Gulf Stream further south. Sea levels are climbing, but in other works, Hansen has projected much higher levels this century than other mainstream science has published, in works like the IPCC reports. Where conservative scientists suggest 1 meter or 3 feet higher seas by the end of this century, more and more I hear 1 meter by 2050 and 3 meters, almost 10 feet, higher by 2100. The second premise for superstorms is the diversion of the Gulf Stream. Really, it is much more like the Gulf Stream than North Americans are taking for granted, and that keeps Britain and North Europe warmer than their latitude should grant them. The whole ocean current is what he's talking about, and it's called AMOC, short for the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. AMOC is the underwater pump that draws warmer waters to the Arctic and North Europe before sending them below for a slow trip towards the Southern Ocean. It's the conveyor belt. The pump is mainly driven by the different weight of salt in the seawater, but that pump could be broken if too much fresh water pours off melting Greenland. The science fiction movie The Day After Tomorrow imagines AMOC breaking down very quickly, appearing suddenly at remote measuring stations in a matter of days. But what about the real world? Satellites and scientists are indeed measuring a large pool of colder, fresher water forming in the Atlantic just south of Greenland. In a world where all the seas are getting hotter, the Greenland blob and another along the melting coast of Antarctica are the exceptions. There is continuing science on the health of the Gulf Stream and the whole overturning system. The previous consensus finds the Gulf Stream has been weakened by 15 to 20% compared to 1950. That is a significant change, but certainly not a major disruption yet, and we have new science just out that says there really hasn't been a big change to the Gulf Stream and AMOC. Rummaging through the internet, a dozen scientific papers, and some of my previous guests, I conclude we have not met the conditions required for a new age of superstorms of the type that Hansen is afraid of. We may see hyped up winter storms hitting Britain again, like the relentless bunch harrying the UK in 2013. That is a storm track that pops up. By the way, a 900-mile wide Atlantic storm hit the UK at the end of September this year. Regarding the cooling of Britain and Northern Europe due to the weakening of AMOC, there is another possibility. Perhaps general warming will reduce those little ice age expectations, or even overwhelm those ocean current impacts, so the UK and Northern Europe continue to warm, but warm less than they would have without the AMOC changes. That's a possibility. We have a precedent for this. Several scientists on this show, including Kevin Trenberth, who has published on ENSO for decades, say the arrival of El Niño or La Niña are still major factors for weather in the Americas and beyond, but that signal has been overtaken by human-made warming, and so is no longer the driving force. The same could be true for expectations about a weakening AMOC. Again, we don't know how this will all unravel as we create a shift in Earth's energy balance.
Check out the Radio Ecoshock website. We're at ecoshock.org.
Australian scientist Andrew Glickson warns the Greenland meltwater could trip a switch, creating a major cooling in the north called a stadial freeze. He told me, quote, temperatures would drop in high latitude regions and still keep rising in the tropics and subtropics. Not that this is necessarily good news, he says, since the consequences of extreme storminess would cause havoc due to the clash of extreme weather fronts, in particular in marginal island systems and continental margins, end quote. You can see Glickson's paper published May 31st, 2019 in the journal Climatic Change titled North Atlantic and sub-Antarctic ocean temperatures, possible onset of a transient stadial cooling stage. I don't know if or when a cold period might hit eastern Canada, Britain, and northern Europe. I'm not sure anybody does. Just the fact that such large consequences are out there unknown should be a big red flag for rapid climate action. If there is a connection between the cold blob below Greenland and the record number of tropical hurricanes and typhoons in 2020, I haven't found it published yet. For now, we can discount any arrival of the Hansen ultra superstorms at this early date. Most scientists go back to the two forces we know about: rising seas, which add height to storm surges, and critically, hotter sea surface temperatures. Of course, when it comes to damage and lives lost, there are other factors. World population is still expanding rapidly. There's been a mass migration towards the coasts in many countries, from America to China and beyond. People build mansions or hovels right on the sea and right in the path of the storms. They want the scenic ocean. There's an old saying, if you can see the sea can see you. Global trade has accelerated too, and there's port growth in industry and airports right near the sea. Even so, when Cat 4 or 5 storms roll in, there's always going to be massive damage, including to food production. Now we know hurricanes and typhoons are carrying more water and dumping it further inland than ever before. Each time, cities try to rebuild, insurance companies pay until they can pay no more. Most insurance companies in America have stopped selling near the Gulf or the East Coast. Homeowners buy insurance from the government, which means all taxpayers are hit with each mega storm. Coupled with rising seas, these superstorms could force relocation of airports near the sea and eventually flood big underground systems like Boston's Big Dig and the Manhattan subway system, which did flood during Hurricane Sandy. Over the coming years, humans will have to give up ground to the sea. Storms are exclamation marks to that death sentence. If you want to follow up on this, you can find links to pretty well everything that I've talked about in my weekly show blog at ecoshock.org. It's published Wednesdays at ecoshock.org. For this week's show, I will add a list of previous Ecoshock interviews with scientists about the threats and challenges of superstorms. Dig in and find out for yourself. I'm Alex Smith. Thank you for listening and learning about our world.
You're listening to Ecoshock Radio for the world.
I'm Alex Smith. Get it all at our website, ecoshock.org.